Hey guys, so some time ago someone asked if I would show them how to use box cutter with the grid snapping settings. And so we're going to do that in this video, but we're going to talk about using the grid as well to create all kinds of stuff, whether it's 2D designs, 3D models. We're just going to have a little bit of fun with this. All right, so let's start with box cutter first, and we'll get this out of the way. Box cutter over here, turn it on and use snap and check that box, and you'll see that we have grid snapping now. So if we hold control, you'll see it shows up under on the normal of whatever you have created. So if this cube was chamfered right here, it'll show up at an angle, right? And so we can use this to start doing cuts and whatnot, right? If we hold control and middle mouse wheel around, we can set it to 1, and that's going to match the Blender grid. Okay, so that's going to be every meter. If you hold control and shift, you'll snap to every 10 centimeters, like so. All right, now you could use it with a standard box, or you can use the N-gon cutter by hitting the D key. And we'll use the N-gon cutter real quick. If you start here, you can hold control here. It'll use that normal. Now we can keep holding control and hit shift. We can actually start off the shape. We don't have to start directly on the shape. So we can do our box cuts like so, or a cut like so anyways. Do that. We can press G and it'll move around on the normal. And if you want to move it in or out of the surface, you hit Z. That's the main thing there. So move it, and then you can hit G again and hit Z. So, all right. So that's the easiest way of using the grids to start modeling, basically. But sometimes you want it to align to certain things. And in our case here, let's take this corner and chamfer it. You'll see it'll snap like this, or it'll start on those normals like so. All right, but maybe we want to line up to this edge here, and it doesn't really do that. So you can go ahead and come up here, set this to nearest edge, and it'll line up to that edge now if you start near it. Okay, if you start in the center, it'll go back to, well, in this case it's not doing it, but a lot of times it'll go back to, let's try this one up. Yeah, it's lined up with the edge right now. Go to the center, it'll line back up like so, or the nearest edge anyway. Right? Okay, so that means you can cut at angles as well if you wanted to. That maybe. Okay, so you don't have to just do that with N-gons. You can do it with regular boxes as well. And it's a super useful way of working anyways. All right. Now, let's go ahead and delete quick. Okay, a cube again. Let's do something for now. All right. So sometimes, like when you're working, you're doing those N-gon cuts, you see we're kind of going in these weird directions maybe we don't want to go, right? Well, what we can do instead, we can right click and get out of that. If we have up here view align and ortho checked, we start in the side view, we hold control, you'll see it still lines up to the nearest edge and it's using object, right? If we start out here though, it's going to be an ortho, right? A view align to ortho. So we can cut like this as well. Let's try it again. Can line up on the grid like that, possibly, right? So that's something you can do. You press 1 to here if needed, like such, right? Okay. Now that doesn't always work out the way you expect it to. So you can set it to view only, or you can click this little icon over here. So you'll see that we can actually click the icon, sets it to view. Might want to start in this area, for example. Make sure our object's selected. We'll talk about making stuff here in a sec as well. So we press E, E again, back and forth with it. Hit B if you want to do a bevel. I'll swell it up. And you can also hit Q, and it should do the interior section. If it doesn't actually bevel the interior, you might have to press E, and well, maybe it won't work on this one. You used to be able to reverse them, but a lot of times you'll have to hit Q to bevel the interior. In our case, I'm not sure exactly why that didn't work, but usually it works. So, all right, so that's just how you can get some cuts going and working with it. Now, here's the fun thing. One of the main reasons I bought box cutter is to use the N-gon cutter here to actually create objects. So right now, we can set this back to kind of its default setup here using object, local, Okay, and okay. So if we hold control, we have it set to 1, right? It lines up to the grid. So we can create the shapes of rooms. Let's try it again. We're having some clipping issues. Click and drag or click. Create the shapes of maybe like rooms in an environment if we wanted to, right? Press E, you can bring it out. And you'll see we can also hold control here and snap it. And it'll snap every meter as well. So if we want to make that 3 meters tall, we can do that, or we can do 4 meters tall. Right? And so that's the idea of a basic room. So if you had backface culling on, go into edit mode, press A, Alt N, and flip everything. There you go. It'll look like that. And this is how I learned to model interior environments by doing basic block out shapes like that, and then just doing this more or less in a destructive manner as opposed to a non-destructive manner. This is at a 45-degree angle. This is not at a 45-degree angle. And this is where the grid absolutely helps because you can turn on absolute grid snapping here. I don't know if that influences anything we've done to this point, but absolute grid snapping is super useful because you can just snap that grid point, and there you go. So now it's all nice and easy. Much better anyways because they're both 45-degree angles. All right, so we have that going. Later on, what would more than likely happen, there's different things you can do, and you can still use box cutter for this. So you can use the N-gon cutter if you wanted to start in like a view area. Try that again. Start off the object, do view. We might cut right to that edge, perhaps. In this case, it's not working out. Reason is sure. Try it again. Okay, it's not lined up to the grid. So it is going off of local object, right? So you see the origin point? It's not on the grid. That's why we're having issues, right? So we can also use other things like world if needed. We can use the Z-axis, X-axis, or Y-axis. In our case, this is the Y-axis because we don't see it here. X is left and right, Z is up and down. So we can actually use that maybe as well. But it's still not ever going to line up for like a modular workflow anyways. So it is important to think about your origin points and where they're placed and whether it's going to work for a modular environment. Now, in this case, the origin point's here in the center. We can hit Control period. We can access that. We can, once again, we can use this absolute grid snapping to press G and hold Control. We can snap it where we need it to go, basically. We want to put it down here in this base corner. We can do that. And we hit Control period. We can turn that off now. Also, take note, our object right now, Z-axis is pointed down, so it's actually rotated upside down, basically. Z is actually up. So you can always fix these while this is on by rotating and holding Control, snapping like that. And you can set up its local rotation, basically. Tweak those rotation values there on the end panel. So Control period, and get rid of that. If we look at our move tool, the gizmo will follow that if you were using local. So you can see that's global. This is local. So we might want to take this and then rotate it so that it matches basically. -90, there you go. And so now local and global are the same basically. All right. Some things you can do there. And Blender, for whatever reason, I think to avoid like gimbal lock or something, it creates these off values. So just press Control A, apply rotation scale. Is that going to be absolutely perfect of an alignment here? Maybe, maybe not. I don't think this one is particularly. Sometimes it's better to use machine tools, Shift S, align to edge. You'll see when we do that and we go back to local, machine tools from here on out, once again, it's rotated weird. Blender has some weird issues with that sometimes, so just keep that in mind. You might just do like Shift S, cursor to origin, and then Shift S, origin to cursor. And now you know that's for sure correct. And so now you can just move this out, hold Control. So whenever you're running into issues like that, just think about it a little bit and you'll find solutions to them usually. So whatever the case, we have an interior piece perhaps. And as long as we don't have this selected, we can keep creating new objects using box cutter, right? So box cutter in object mode. So you can see we can change this back to maybe world Z. Keep going with our building here. we wanted to. Yeah, it's easier to do this like this. So we press E, bring it up. This one here, we can move it and hold Control and snap it at the same time. Like, boom, we have 2 room space. All right, so this, I don't want to get into too much of just doing architectural type stuff, but just a quick tip. If you solidify this, you push it in, hit Alt-Z so you can see it. You'll see we can change that to like a 0.1. This is kind of the whole idea of a modular building anyways, in a nutshell, is that you'll have to have some thickness to floor. The floors more than likely. I guess this one's negative 0.1. There you go. More than likely, you'll have to have some thickness to your floors and ceilings. Thing that often happens. And thickness to your walls. When you're making modular units, kind of going off track here, anyways. When you're making modular units, the most common setup that you'll see guys using is that they're doing walls like this, right? So in Y and 2. They're just doing big blocky walls like this. You can convert this kind of stuff into big blocky sections later on if needed. But if you're just going to be doing, this is like the kind of the older way of doing things when you're not doing everything modular. This is going to work as well, basically. A lot of times you separate floors. So if you're just curious about all this, separate floors, it does the same thing, right? You might keep the ceilings on, you might not, you might separate those too. But you'll just have walls at some point, basically. And when you set up you probably wouldn't do this with box cutter necessarily. You might, but a lot of times you will set up a door cut where like a door frame would go. This would be a socket. You'd set up a cutter specifically for that process. Most correct, I think. And you would be able to use this cutter. You would make it a kit item. You put it in your asset browser if you want. You standardize your door and window units for game environments, and then you can just create cuts for the areas you want the door to be, and you can swap the door model in and out, basically. And as long as this is lined up on the grid as well, it's going to be much easier to place doors later on in the appropriate areas. So your origin points here would matter as well, and if they're on the grid or not. Right? So you'll be able to do those kinds of punches in those kinds of areas, and the floor won't be affected by that. Kind of a fun way of doing it, because now you can just duplicate that, use it in other areas. You'll see here we can select that, shift select this, boolean it. By the way, I'm using hard ops to do booleans, but you can certainly use bool tools doing brush boolean differences this way. Also, if you are going to use bool tools, it comes with Blender. You just have to enable it in preferences add-ons. Use brush boolean differences over here. What you'll find is that when you use this one, it's going to give you the option to hide and unhide your cutters basically over here as well. So it's kind of a fun thing you can do. You don't want to use hard ops, or you don't have hard ops anyways. But yeah, you can start punching things like that basically. So shift tilde key, you can use WASD to fly around, or you hit G. Now, when you do booleans, of course, it's going to create some extra vertices sometimes that you don't really need, so you have to go back and fix that. But yeah, you can punch out interiors using the grid settings with box cutters and all that fun stuff involved with it, right? So that's great, but let's go over to Creative for a second. I want to talk about grids. I've talked about it on the channel a little bit, but let's talk about it a little bit more. So first, in Krita, you'll want to do Dockers, Grids and Guides Docker right here. Show grid whenever you have that set up so you can see it. I turn subdivisions down. You can turn them up if you want, or down, whatever. And then I'm going to turn up the spacing a little bit. Zoom in to 100%. So we got a grid. Now, the color of it, I just set it to black and turn the alpha channel down to something like 50 and click OK. And that'll give you a setup like this anyways. And of course, I got a gray background for my document, which is a fill layer. You can set that up when you create new files. Let me just go over that too. I kind of skip that in every video. When you create a new document under content, see it has fill layer or render layer, gray, and then layers 2. So I get my second layer for free, basically. So grids are super useful, and so even though you now know how to kind of use them with Box Cutter and in Blender, the problem is that when I'm going to use this brush here, just a little marker brush. I've modified it slightly, but it's basically the same. So The problem is even when you have grids to work with, if you don't know how to use the grids, they don't really matter that much. So a lot of times when you're looking at things like websites, you can hold V to use the line tool here in Krita while using your brush. Hold Shift to snap it. When you're looking at like websites and graphic designs, it's a big thing in that. It's a big thing in architectural design as well. But for websites, it's going to be something like this. You might have a header, a body, or even like newspaper articles. You'll have a footer. So there's actually kind of a grid theory that a lot of people rely on in order to set up their little tiled sections. And then later on, you might break these tiled sections down even further. You have like 3 in this area, perhaps. And you might have like a little header, right, in there, or like a bold header or whatever. And then you have like text fill here. And then you might have an image. You might have text fill, or you have like links. And so there's different ways of stylizing things, basically, using these kind of templates, if you would, right? Well, this little section here, between these two, there might be some spacing between those. They might just be a bar there. Who knows, right where the grid is. But a lot of times there's a little bit of space in between all these things. All right, and that's going to be known as a gutter, all right? I just want to point that out because this spacing is super important when you're doing any kind of design work on how far everything is spaced from each other. And that's why in Photoshop, it automatically does it. Krita doesn't have it really, but Affinity Photo does, Affinity Designer. So if you're using any kind of graphic design software, you always know your spacing. Super, super important, right? Because when you're creating anything, let's say this wasn't a website. Let's say this was a server in a computer room or something, server farm in a game environment, and we were trying to, or like an electrical panel or breaker. You see how that you can take those elements, work them into a design for like the face of the, or like you open up the door and there's the computer stuff inside of it. Maybe you could do like pipes in between each other or something like that. And then you could add additional elements like some like LED lights up here or something, right? So any kind of design work that's very cubic in nature, a lot of times this is what you're looking at. When you're coming up with hard surface sci-fi elements, you could just trace out on a grid and just kind of make interesting shapes if you wanted to. And then you can turn these into your hard surface items. You would possibly bevel corners. There's different ways you can kind of think about doing this. You could just go for it, just try to bevel it. But you can also do circles. And this is, once again, a kind of graphic design thing where you add circles and bam, you can actually add bevels to those areas. So you can start making the shape more interesting. Now, design in general, you are doing primary, secondary, and tertiary details, or you can think of these as large, medium, and small. But a lot of times you want to take this main shape that you've created, and you want to break it up, right? Because that's going to give you your medium or secondary shapes usually. So if you were to cut this up aesthetically and pleasing so that the secondary shapes here complement the primary, it's going to look better, basically. That's not to say you can't add additional elements in here that are also secondary shapes, right? You don't have to always just break it apart. But when you create parting lines or panel lines, things like that, it'd be super useful to make this thing more interesting. So if I do like a cut down this way, maybe we're trying to match like these angles here. So this is a 45-degree angle, so we probably do a 45-degree cut. That might look a little bit nicer. A little bit of a hierarchy to everything. So we can break it like this. So we have, this is like 70% of the shape. This is like 30% of the shape or something like that. It's going to be more interesting than doing a 50-50 for sure. And then on top of that, you can create the idea of gutters as well. You want to think of this as a gutter. And so now if we go back through that in, we'll use the actually that. I think. I don't mess up my brush too much. We'll erase that real quick. I don't know if I can use the line tool. I've never really tried. There we go. I guess I can. All right, so here we go. You could separate the shapes into kind of their own thing, but keep them combined somehow with like a little dropped-in section. You could shade these a little bit just to remember it's a dropped-in section. And so you're coming up with a more interesting design already. So now all you would have to do is more or less start thinking about all the other additional elements you might want, little small details. And so when you look at shapes on like Pinterest or wherever, and you'll start recognizing now that they do a lot of stuff like this. So I highly recommend, if you're learning to design stuff, go to Pinterest or wherever, take a, just copy the image and throw it into Photoshop or wherever you're working, and start kind of thinking about how they laid out their edges and how they broke up their shapes, right? Like what was probably their primary shape they started with, and then how did they turn that into what you see in front of you, right? It's doing a lot of stuff like this, working with grids basically. Not always the case, but a lot of times it is, right? And eventually you'll find yourself getting away from the whole 45-degree angle thing. Also, this isn't a 45, so that might throw this shape a little bit. Might look okay, who knows? Sometimes you can get away, and a lot of times you can get away with using irregular edges. Like they don't always have to match each other. So just keep that in mind. Grids are super, super powerful. So even if you're doing like a vehicle, for example, like let's say this was like a crazy tank in the future or something, or battle tank, or like a battle zone thing or something, I don't know. Whatever, some kind of tank. See, until you assign a function to your shapes, they're just going to be abstract, right? So like later on, we know we might need our tank tracks like in certain areas, certain sizes or whatever. And then we'd have circles like every grid or every other grid or whatever, right? And so if I got that, oh, I spaced it right. All right, cool. That was an accident. But anyways, so we can start to figure out like what we're going to create, how big it needs to be, what kind of elements it has on it. Is it going to have gas tanks that hang down in this area? All right, and this brings me to kind of a way of, well, kind of a way that I learned to do art, is that before you even think about making something super complex, you got to figure out where things live. So when you have like a picture that you're trying to create, like on canvas or whatever, let's say you're just doing an animal, you need to know where that animal is going to live. Like maybe you have a mountain, you got to figure out like where all these things are going to go. So using the rule of thirds for composition, we can start to line things up into thirds, right? In those little areas maybe, right? We're looking at like first point of interest, second point of interest, third, and fourth. But you can place a subject on a line entirely, and that's something you could do, right? So if we have some kind of animal, I don't know, donkey or something, some kind of little rough stick figure animal, he would look interesting there, like so, but maybe he would look more interesting if larger and perspective to him. Who knows? You know what I'm saying? And so maybe his eyes down here, maybe it's up here. Who knows? Something like that. If you put his main eye here, this will be nice. But then if you do the mountains down here low, this will be a little bit more interesting. You know what I'm saying? Instead of putting mountains up here necessarily. But if you put an alien spaceship over here about to shoot the donkey, and there's blasters coming in or something, you see what I'm saying? You can have fun with composition like this. You just have to recognize where things live first before you start working the details of all of them, or even their primary shapes. Same thing here. You're working that big idea of where it lives first. Like, where's this tank track going to go? Where's the cannon going to go? Right? And then where's a door going to go later on? Like, that's maybe not the most important thing right off the bat. Sometimes it can be, but you can use the grid to do this. Even with organic designs, if you want to just start like free sketching some stuff out, it's a little bit more curvy. Just remember, whenever you create a shape, right? If you bend an edge, it starts to look more organic. That's the easiest way to remember this. It starts to look more organic, even if you leave one side flat. And then you can do like your bevel here. And then so you can do like a chop out, cut out, something like that, right? But even when you start just free sketching like really loose organic stuff, eventually you can use that grid to kind of get back to reality on where things might need to be placed and positioned and what their proportions are to each other, because this gives you a good sense of proportion on the whole shape here, right? Like, so we can say like for sure that this is needs to be split at maybe like 25% areas or 30% areas, whatever. So we would split maybe here and take it all the way back over to here and split back here, you know, instead of doing it somewhere in the middle here. So we have like this big empty section in the middle. But we can start working these kind of things out very quickly. And one of the big problems with Blender is that when you start doing that with like subdivision surfaces, it's a little challenging with box cutter. You're not going to like, box cutter doesn't work that way really. That's kind of the main thing, right? It kind of wants to, but it doesn't, because it's working off the normals usually. But you'll notice in orthographic views, we don't have that issue, right? Like we can do kind of whatever we want in an orthographic view. We can even use subdivision, not a big deal. We can make things happen over here, and we can still see a grid behind it, just like I was just doing. All right. The only thing about working with grids, well, when you're designing things and you're coming up with your own ideas, the hardest part about all of this is that when you enter into 3D, you're fighting your tools. You're going to feel separated from the design process. You're going to be more worried about using the tools a lot of times instead of just designing things. So it's really useful to kind of get your thoughts going in 2D and then work them out a little bit more in 3D, where you fight with them a little bit later on. And now, but we always have the grid available to us in these orthographic views when we hit Alt-Z, right? So we can always see, what we need to create and when and where. For this particular one, I'm just going to apply this, and we can still use box cutter on subdivision stuff. But I'm going to use the N-gon cutter. We have the shape selected, so if I want to cut here to here, back to here, maybe I bend in here somewhere, then cut back down to here, right? So we can still do this big cut like this, maybe. Or we could press X and we could do a slice, right? So we press E and we can actually do more or less our parting lines there if we wanted to, right? And so now we can also middle mouse click and bevel this. This is going to be a weighted bevel. All right. I'm going to talk about how you can modify those here in a second. The weighted bevels are just the modifier, the bevel modifier, set to weighted. That's the easiest way to remember it. All right. So when we look at that shape, press select one of these with hard ops. You can hit Q and E, bring back the cutter, and you'll see that it's set to bevel here, and it's using weight. All right, now I'm using the modifier list add-on, but you'll see that the limit method is set to weight. All right, we go into edit mode. This is actually a very simple shape, but when we press N, bring out side panel, go to item, we have bevel weights here, so we can tweak these values. Our offset size here, this is our limit. Like if we set it really low, none of these bevels will go past that point, basically, right? Like they're all going to be small. But if we set it really large, we can now tweak each one of these individually, pretty much however we see fit until they run into each other or another edge. And then it might start shrinking things and doing some odd stuff like that. But you certainly can do this. So like if this one here wasn't quite right, it's not matching the curve that I want, maybe, we can change the bevel weight around and right. And so eventually we can get that going. This piece we can actually scale if we wanted to. Or we could try to create a cut line all the way around it and whatnot. And just go to town with it, basically. But this is the main idea of using grids, guys. Like it's just there for you to utilize to help aid you during the design process, but also during the modeling process, right? So you can create better looking artwork. You just have to understand how to use them more so than anything else. The tools aren't necessarily there's some little ins and outs about them, perhaps. I'll try to show you the ones I think that are most important, but there might be some little odd and end areas where you run into issues with it, where you might not be able to do something and you really want to do it. So just understanding how to design with the grid first, I think, is much more beneficial than just utilizing box cutter straight out of the gate and hoping to get things done that way. Because it does take practice to understand, how to make interesting shapes and interesting cuts. And then on top of that, now you have to do it in all 3 dimensions, right? So even though, we could just do this as if we were doing a 2D piece, when you're doing certain kinds of objects, let's just do a cube real quick. Take this out, scale it up, scale it back in. Maybe we're doing some stuff like this, maybe. But maybe when we do, I'm just going to do some regular polygonal modeling. So this is still useful for regular modeling, right? K and C. Right, we do a cut through here, kind of like what we just did, basically. But I'm going to grab that whole loop and bevel it and set it. All right. So now we're adding detail here. We're adding detail here, and they kind of work with each other, basically. You know what I'm saying? Like you're working in all 3, you're working on like top, left, bottom, right, 3 dimensions as opposed to just a 2-dimension shape. So you're working a form. And so you need to think about how you can make this interesting with that setup like that. And you're still worrying about the subshapes you're creating. So you're still thinking about your secondary shapes, right? And your tertiary details and all that other fun stuff. this whole area here, if I grab that loop, I can do select loop, inner loop region. Maybe I inset and hold control and bring that one out now. Right, so you can see it's pretty interesting from that angle. It's pretty interesting from, well, it's got a lot of, you can make different shapes across the different angles, basically, right? So you have a lot more to think about, a lot more to design, a lot more to do. And you need to be thinking about these things as you do them. And don't forget to just use regular booleans along. You don't always have to use box cutter. You can use regular boolean shapes. If they don't line up, align your cursor, Shift S, cursor to selected. Start doing that. Easiest way to do that, in my opinion. But later on, just pull that through. Bring it. I don't know where I want it yet, so we'll find out in a second. But I think I should go all the way through, do a boolean subtraction, bevel it in here. That. Make it a little thinner, a little bit more balanced. And we could taper things and do all kinds of other fun stuff. We can use bin modifiers, lattice modifiers. That's where all those technical tools are going to really start to slow you down when you're trying to design, basically. So when you guys are asking in some of my other videos, like how I design things anyways, I take it step by step with like planes. This is why I've shown a number of times working with planes. It's a way easier for me to just think about something as I'm going and make it more complicated looking and more interesting, perhaps, because I'm just looking at this shape right now. And then later on, I might shift over here and be looking at this shape, trying to think about, how's this all going to start working at some point. And I could solidify it. And then in this case, I can almost get away with a subdivision. Yeah. Right click, shade it smooth. And so then don't forget also, not everything has to be one shape or one object. If you create a cylinder later on, create a cylinder. Something like that. And so this can turn into like a drone or something, or some kind of alien thing or something. Get the idea. And you can see as we do that chamfer, you see how the angle is at 45 degrees all the way through? Right, so sometimes you don't want that behavior. Hit M a few times when doing bevels or chamfers. And you can switch it to, see if I can get it to do it. You can switch it to percentage. All right. In our case, it's not really not doing what I thought it was going to do. Maybe we can do bevel like that, but maybe not a chamfer. Never realized that. Percentage. All right. I don't know what's happening with that one. So AM merged by distance. It doesn't have an interior edge to deal with, so we're going to inset. This is what's. You can do a chamfer, hit M a few times, maybe 3. Yeah, there you go. Now it's behaving the way I expected. All right. That's why it wasn't. You inset, hold control while using inset. Inset, hold control, easy. And if cylinders, a lot of times you can just add a bevel to it before the subdivision, and it will hold the shapes. It'll create all your holding edges, as long as it's not like a complex cylinder. So you can hit Control 2 and subdivide it. And yeah, that's it, guys. So when you're trying to just come up with ideas and model things, have fun with it. But it's going to be more challenging to come up with your designs on the fly if you're not used to doing all this, basically. Start here, play around with this a little bit. It doesn't have to be great artwork. Just get used to creating the shapes you need to create. So take images of things you want to create, whatever you might want to work on. Like if it's a submarine, do that. A tank. Start figuring out their primary shapes and their big overall forms, and then start worrying about details after the fact. You'll find that you can break down even relatively simple objects can turn into dozens and dozens of shapes. Really complex stuff can be thousands potentially. Now, your job as a 3D artist, of course, if you're creating game models and stuff, is to be efficient. So trying to figure out like the best way to do repeating elements, all that comes into play as well. And that's part of creating design language as well. So if you use kind of the same details across an object and just a nice composition, evenly distributed, and clusters and things like that, it'd be quite useful. You save time where you can, basically. I'm getting at. So anyways, so hopefully this video answered that question about using box cutter. and even more. And hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll check you out in the next one. All right, take care.